Good morning, everyone. This is John Heerdink. I'm the managing member of TriPublic, a company that enables consumers and investors to gain access to and understanding from leaders and experts across all industries. Today, welcome to TriPublic CEO presentation and Q&A event titled, I'm going to go with EOE and let our esteemed colleague and expert today tackle the actual name, but the emerging digestive disorder frequently misdiagnosed. Again, please note that TriPublic's website is www.tribepublic.com. That's TRIBE public.com. And that, again, I'm also the managing member of another LLC called Vista Partners, which is a registered investment advisor in California, and its website is vistapglobal.com. Please be kind enough to review both sets of disclaimers at each site, and know that I am acting as an advisor to today's company, Eupraxia Pharmaceuticals, and it trades on both the TSX and the Nasdaq under the ticker symbol EPRX. Again, that's EPRX. As many of you know, we have members that have freely joined us from 31 plus countries and are now invited to submit names via our free wish list process, where you can submit names of experts and CEOs of companies that are listed or private companies from all sectors, and continue to encourage folks to get in front of the companies that they want to learn from, the CEOs and experts that they want to learn from. And that's both through webinars like we're doing today, which are fairly efficient, approximately 30 minutes in nature, where we also provide a Q&A session. Thanks again for those of you that already sent in your questions, but know that we via the Zoom chat feature today, you can also send in additional questions, and we'll do our best to get them addressed. And if we don't do it on this one, we'll endeavor to do so afterwards. After this event, we'll work efficiently to try to get today's event video published at the TriPublic YouTube channel, and also included in the Tribe This Week, which is our weekly Friday e-newsletter that encourages this same wish list process and gives you updated and learn even more through video and stories and updates and progress on these companies and many others that the tribe care about. Today's co-host is Dr. James Helliwell. He's the co-founder and chief executive officer of Eupraxia Pharmaceuticals. Again, that's traded on the TSX and Nasdaq under the ticker EPRX. Eupraxia is a clinical stage biotechnology company leveraging its proprietary diffuser technology to optimize drug delivery for applications with significant unmet need. Dr. Helliwell is a board-certified cardiac anesthesiologist. He previously maintained a busy coordinary clinical and academic practice with the focus on cardiac transplantation, and held a double tenure as president of the Anesthesiologist of BC. Thanks again to Eupraxia for joining us, and thanks again to all tribe members that are on today. And please let others know that they can join us from around the world. And also note that we are now live again in 35 event sites across the US, where we also host these in-person events with these same experts, primarily via luncheon or dinner event formats, or speaking engagements where we piggyback on top of existing meetings that you may be hosting anyway. So let us know if we're not coming to your city just yet, or to an area in your city yet, and we'll do our best to try to create events around your interest and these brilliant experts like today's Dr. Helliwell. Now let's get started. So James, you've got your PowerPoint up here. Thanks for doing so. And maybe start to tell us just a little bit more about yourself again, and also just go right into your PowerPoint as you feel appropriate. Thank you.
Excellent, John. Well, thank you so much for hosting today. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who's taking the time to be here live, or those who are watching it on YouTube later. So thank you for the introduction. And as you said, I am a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist. So for those who wonder what that really means, essentially, I worked in an operating room doing heart transplants, and it was my job to make sure that patients got to sleep safely, that we got them through getting the old heart out, the new heart in, get the new heart started, and then looked after them in the intensive care unit afterwards. The thing that I learned in that job was that precision matters. So there are lots of drugs, and the key thing is about how you give those drugs. You want to be incredibly precise about the dose that you're giving, where you're giving them, so you're targeting the tissues that matter, and also how long you're giving it. You want the time to be not too short or not too long. And so today we're going to be talking about what we do at Eupraxia, but I really want to introduce eosinophilic esophagitis, or EOE. And most people do call it EOE because eosinophilic esophagitis is a bit of a mouthful. So what's really interesting about this disorder is that it is relatively new. And so here you can see this sort of conceptual definition. And I'm not going to read that. And instead, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. So when I went through medical school, which was longer ago than I care to admit, this was not a disease we learned about. This was not a disease we talked about. Instead, we saw patients with these symptoms. And the symptoms that people come in with are difficulty swallowing, pain on swallowing, food that gets stuck. And essentially, we would go in, we would remove the stuck food, and we would talk to them about chewing more, not having bread and steak together, drinking more water, and we would rule out cancer. After that, we'd say, maybe you have reflux, and send them on their way. Well, in fact, what's been discovered, discovered by people who are on our clinical advisory board, are the discoverers of this disease. They noticed that there were these cells called eosinophils, which is where the eosinophilic esophagitis comes from. Eosinophils are part of an allergic reaction in the body, and they can come up in all sorts of places. And what they noticed that is consistent is that in these patients who are having these symptoms, that when they biopsy them, so that means they go in and they take a piece of tissue while they're down with their scope, it's called an endoscope, to take video and pictures, they can also take a biopsy. When they do that, they find lots of eosinophils and lots of inflammation. And that inflammation leads to dysfunction, leads to fibrosis, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And essentially, one of the things that you find with these patients is that these can be kind of generic symptoms. A lot of you will look at this and say, I have some of these things. And in fact, that's part of what we are discovering, is that a lot of the things that we've thought of as benign symptoms or related to reflux, related to something else, you didn't chew your food enough, you didn't drink enough. In fact, what we're finding is that this difficulty swallowing, it turns out, is very often, if you biopsy, actually eosinophilic esophagitis. And so you can see here the clinical presentation, and on the side, it's impact. And again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what you'll find is for these patients, it becomes more and more disruptive as they go. So they find it difficult to sort of eat food, difficult to drink fluids. And so what happens is they start to adapt to what the problem is. So they'll chew a lot longer. They'll take a lot longer to eat. They won't want to go out for dinner with friends. They will want to eat alone. They will look for soft foods. And they will find themselves in a position where they're also still going to their doctor and saying, I think there's a problem. And yet they generally just sort of get told there's probably not a problem. You just need to adapt to this. And so one of the things that we're finding, so dysphagia is difficulty swallowing. So you'll see on the left-hand side, it says EOE is now seen in more than 50% of food impactions. What's a food impaction? What it means is you're eating and the food actually quite literally gets stuck between your mouth and your stomach in the esophagus. And so you go to the emergency room, you're in great pain. They have to rule out a heart attack. They go in, they check, they find food there. And what they're finding is that when they take that food out, they take the pictures and biopsies, that in fact you have these eosinophils and you have this inflammatory disorder. And this is starting to become quite a big burden in emergency departments. And when you look through the details of this slide, what you're finding is, if you look at over on the right-hand side, you'll see more than 700,000 emergency room visits for dysphagia, food impaction, or esophageal stricture. The majority of those we discover are in fact EOE. If you think about this in context of another disease, this is the wrong place to diagnose EOE. If we think of cancer, our goal is to screen for it, find it early, and treat it when it is localized. By the time it is metastasized or stage 4, that's the wrong time to find it. By the time you are having a food impaction in an emergency room, you are kind of the EOE equivalent of stage 4. And that's why this really is the tip of the iceberg. This disease has been diagnosed incredibly late because there isn't yet enough education to get doctors who are not specialists in this disease to actually be sending these people to the specialist to be able to be assessed, screened, and diagnosed with EOE to be treated. Because if you can treat it earlier, you can actually avoid, ideally, the progression of the disease so that you can actually stop the fibrosis that occurs, the inflammation that occurs, and the strictures. And strictures are where it gets really quite narrow. So this disease was, until very recently, an orphan disease. What does that mean? That means that there were fewer than 200,000 patients in the United States. And so the main drug that is approved today, it's a drug called Dupixent by Regeneron Sanofi. And it's really the first drug that was approved for the treatment of this disease and was very welcomed by patients. It was approved as an orphan drug because that's how few patients were there when they came along. And that wasn't too long ago, just about 3 years ago. So this is actually what's happening. So there's incidence and there's prevalence. Prevalence is sort of how many people have the disease, and incidence is how many people are being diagnosed with it every year, basically. If you look at the studies that are occurring around the world, what they are finding is that both prevalence is rising very rapidly and incidence is rising very rapidly. So there's two things that are happening here. Number one is we're actually looking for the disease now. So as the first treatment in Dupixent in the United States really became available, people started looking a little bit more and they found it. And boy, did they ever find it. The latest estimate, and these estimates are always backwards looking, is already that there's at least 500,000 patients with EOE in the United States. So going up almost fivefold from what it was just a few years ago. And the projection is that that rate of increase is going to continue at the same pace as we get better with screening, better education of physicians to look for the disease, and also as treatments become available, and we hope to have one of those treatments on the market before too long to be able to provide safe, effective, and long-term treatment, which means that there's a strong benefit to diagnosing early because there's treatment that can alter the natural history of the disease, stopping you getting to food impactions, fibrosis, and the risk of cancer. So when we think about this, we really want to understand that the disease as it is today is growing very, very rapidly. And the second piece of that is that when you talk to the experts in the field, and one of the absolute top in the field is Dr. Evan Dellin, who chairs our clinical advisory board. He's a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And really, when he is looking at this, he is describing this sort of absolute sort of constant growth and believes that there is something in the environment that is actually stimulating this allergic reaction, and meaning that it is not just that we're diagnosing more, the rate of the disease is actually increasing as well. So let's look a little bit, we'll step back from that sort of how many people have the disease and it's rapidly rising. So as we're sort of nearing that 1 million patient mark and getting closer, what's actually happening in these patients? So this is a diagram just to sort of show you what's happening. On the left-hand side of the screen, that long tube that you see is going essentially from the mouth to the stomach. The bottom is what it would look like when you take a biopsy and you look at it under a microscope. And the round piece is looking down the esophagus. So as you swallow, it's what's there. Now, the esophagus is just this tube. It's very distensible. In other words, it goes in and out and it flexes. So when you take a big bite of food, it opens up, takes the food, and allows it to pass through to the stomach. What you'll see as you progress through this disease is it starts with inflammation. And that inflammation is the start of that process. It leads to some discomfort. It leads to difficulty in swallowing, but there's not yet any permanent changes that are happening. The second step is you start to get this fibrosis. So what that means is almost like scar tissue. Now, as we all know, when we have scars, once those scars are there, they are almost impossible to get rid of. They don't flex, they don't move, and that's exactly what happens in your esophagus. You can see it when you look at it. You can see in the diagram here, and you can also see on histology. So histology, again, is that biopsy under the microscope. And then as you progress, you'll notice it gets really narrow in that tube. So when we talk about food impactions, you're at the far right-hand side here. What we want to be doing is diagnosing people on the left-hand side and providing them treatment early. So talking a little bit more about the disease here, and I mentioned a little bit, there's a lot of risk factors here. I'm not going to go into all of these other than to say that nobody really knows exactly what is causing this disease. But as we're seeing it rise again in incidence and we're seeing much more prevalence, so many more people with the disease, at some point we're probably going to get a better sense. One of the things we do know is that a lot of people who have this tend to be people who are a little bit allergic anyway. So for example, they may also have asthma, which is, again, that same kind of allergic reaction. And I will sometimes tell people this is a little bit like asthma, but of the esophagus. So let's talk a little bit about the current treatment algorithm. And unfortunately, if you have this disease, there's not a whole lot for you. So on the right side is diet therapy. Now, there are children who have this disease and adolescents who have this disease, and for them, diet therapy seems to work reasonably well. However, for adults, it works very, very poorly. On the left-hand side, what you'll see is medical therapy. And so the medical therapy, this proton pump inhibition, that's essentially an antacid, which is where people start. And it's often because this is sometimes confused with people who actually have that reflux disease. The next is the use of topical corticosteroids. So that means taking a drug like fluticasone propionate, which is better known as Flovent or Flonase, and is the active ingredient in our treatment, has been used for years where people spray it instead of into their lungs, into their mouth, and swallow it. The problem with that is all it is doing is painting the surface of the tissue, not getting into it, number one. Number two, as soon as you eat or drink, it washes it away. So you have to take it, not eat or drink for several hours, and you need to do that a couple of times a day. The downside of that is because of the way you coat everything, you can actually get a fungal infection, a candidiasis within your mouth, which is a horrible complication, requires further treatment. And so about 60 to 70% of people on this treatment actually stop treatment. The last is dupilumab. Dupilumab is a monoclonal antibody. This is the Sanofi Regeneron Dupixent. It is used for the treatment of not just EOE, but for other disorders as well. It is a systemic treatment. In other words, you give it as an injection once a week for the treatment of this disease, and it goes and gets everywhere in your body as well as into your esophagus. What they find here when they look at the data is 59% of people have a complete remission of eosinophils. In other words, the eosinophils go away. And in their phase 2 study, what they found was they looked at clinical remission, so you felt better, and histologic remission, and only 13% of patients had both. So that means that, only 13% of patients in that phase 2 trial actually had that. Now, they didn't look at that in their phase 3, but it's likely to have been very, very similar. Lastly, is if you're not really treating this and you catching it very late, actually sort of making the esophagus bigger by putting a balloon in there to try and stop the symptoms. So clearly, there's a very big need here for actually doing this. And what we're looking at here is the spectrum of outcomes, and we want to move people over to a normal biopsy in that green. We want to see symptom resolution in a normal esophagus. So there are key things that we want to do here that are really important. And I really put them as 3 things. Number 1, we want to make patients feel better. So that's that clinical remission. And there's a variety of scores that are used, and I'll talk a bit about those. Number 2, we want to make the eosinophils that start this disease reduce in a very meaningful way, and ideally actually go away. And the third, and probably one of the most important things over the long term, is you actually want the biopsies. So with the histology, you want that fibrosis and inflammation to improve and go away. And we measure that with a score called EOE-HSS, which is a histology scoring system for EOE. And I'm sorry, I know we're throwing lots of big stuff at you, and I'll try and make sure that we go through and repeat some of these pieces. So now that we have a sense of the disease, the severity of the disease, the growth of the disease, and really the need for a very effective treatment that is providing both symptom relief and histologic relief, let's talk about our approach to this. So as I said, when I was doing transplants, it was about precision. This is exactly our approach here. Our DiffuSphere technology, which you're looking at on the screen in front of you here, these are the size of a grain of sand. And what they do is think of them as little mini pumps. So we actually place them inside a tissue with great precision. And once there, they release drug in an effective concentration in that tissue for a long period of time. In this instance, we're looking for a year from a single injection. So you would only have to be treated once a year and otherwise have your disease ideally controlled. And so this is about precision. It's about keeping it there. In other words, you're not getting this drug all over your body, hitting all of your other cells that are off target that do not require treatment. The other piece is these patients who have EOE, by the standards of following the disease once a year, are supposed to go in, see their gastroenterologist, have a scope, so they go down with the camera, they take pictures and biopsies. What we are doing is handing the physician this drug to inject into the esophagus during that procedure. The patient does not feel it. It only adds 3 to 5 minutes to the procedure. And so it means that during this procedure, you're already going through, you are getting the treatment. So we have used this in osteoarthritis with great effect, where we have data that was just published in the Lancet from our phase 2b trial of more than 300 patients in osteoarthritis, where we demonstrated excellent efficacy, excellent safety, and long duration, opening up whole new treatments in osteoarthritis as that program enters phase 3 and heads its way to market. The data that we saw there is what you're looking at here. And this is what we call pharmacokinetics, so the way the drug releases. If you think about every drug you've ever taken, it peaks and it troughs, and it peaks and it troughs. That's not what this is. Those little microspheres, the diffuspheres that we put into the esophagus or when we put into the knee, they last a long time with no peak, and they're constantly delivering the medicine you need, but not more than you need for a long duration. And as you can see here in osteoarthritis, it's every 6 months. We are looking at once a year for eosinophilic esophagitis, because that is what best matches. So we are in the middle of a very exciting trial right now. We're going to walk you through a little bit of this data, place it in context of what else is happening. So as a reminder, we have Evan Dellon and the other top 6 EOE doctors in the entire world who are on our clinical advisory board who designed this trial with us. What you can see is we are escalating in dose as we go through the cohorts. There's a reason for that. What we want to do is to find just the right dose where we are giving enough to last a year to get clinical response, so you're feeling better, as well as histological response, so your tissues are healthy, without giving you more drug than you need. So we have now, and we're going to talk about data up to the 5th cohort, and these are still pretty early. And we're going to talk as we go through here, but what's going to happen is when we get to the dose that we think is the right dose, we are going to flip this trial, which has a waiting list of patients wanting to join it. Recruitment is often a challenge in clinical studies, and we have wait lists of patients wanting to join, and physicians wanting to be sites for this trial and for our subsequent phase 3 trial. So we are going to be expanding this trial into a placebo-controlled trial once we get to that right dose. With that data that will be coming, we'll have lots of data through 2025. The next piece of data is Q1 2025. So an incredible number of clinical catalysts as we go. And then a very important one at the early part of 2026 when we unblind that blinded portion as well. So what does this look like before we dive into the data itself? So as we are escalating, we are doing 2 things. We are injecting more of the esophagus, and we are adding more drug per injection site. The data I'm going to be showing you today is only what you see on the left-hand side of each of these images, which means we are only covering 55 to 60% of the esophagus. So when you're looking at this data, we are not yet even treating the entire esophagus, and we are not yet at the dose that we think is going to be the right dose. So placing that in context, let's look at the data. So this is called the Straumann Dysphagia Index. So Dr. Straumann was one of the discoverers of the disease and designed this index to be able to analyze in EOE really how patients were feeling. Straumann is on our clinical advisory board. There are other tools you will see with this. There is one called the DSQ, which is used by a couple of the other products that are out there. And some people talk about dysphagia-free days, so the number of days where you don't have symptoms. The Straumann Dysphagia Index is probably the most high fidelity one. And it is the one with the best definition, really, of where you are in clinical remission. So where you actually are considered to be, sort of close to symptom-free. And that really is that change from baseline of more than 2 becomes clinically meaningful, and more than 3, and you are actually in clinical remission. Now, if you're trying to compare to other products and you're reading other papers, most of them have used DSQ in their phase 3. What's interesting is you can actually look at their phase 2 data, which is very similar to their phase 3 data where they do use that SDI. So it creates for an apples to apples comparison. What you're seeing here is that as we are going up from cohort 3 to cohort 4 to cohort 5, that we are getting a very good dose response. We are getting almost all patients in clinical remission, and all of them are getting a clinical meaningful response. When we look at cohort 4, where we've already seen those patients get to 6 months, it is also durable. Remember, from a single injection at day 0, patients are feeling better to 6 months. Anecdotally, we know that one of our patients in an early cohort 2, remember where we were giving a very small dose, came back to the study physician at 1 year and said, "My symptoms have just come back a year later. Please, can I get another dose?" Unfortunately, we're not able to do that yet, but that anecdotal evidence is supported by what we're seeing here in terms of the response. So we are seeing a great clinical response, which is one of those three key factors that we need to see. And this clinical response is comparable or better than other clinical responses that we're seeing in other programs that are out there. This is one of the biggest barriers for other programs in achieving success, is this clinical response. And this kind of makes sense. Remember, this is an inflammatory disease. We are giving a steroid called fluticasone propionate, which is one of the most potent anti-inflammatories, and we're putting it right into the tissues. So there's no great mystery as to why this is working and working so well. And we look forward to seeing continued dose response. So now we're going to look at some of this more technical piece. And remember, these are biopsies. So there is no placebo effect here. You are taking a piece of tissue and looking at it under a microscope and grading it according to a very big scale. The scale here that matters is you want to see the scores decline by about 0.2. That is where it starts to become meaningful. Here you are seeing a very clear dose response as our cohorts go up. Looking at week 12, which is that 3-month time point, and we're going to be following these patients for up to a year. So you're going to continue to see more data and more time points. But you can see for the stage, so just like in cancer, the stage is the extent of the disease. Cohort 3, you can see a 15% reduction. Cohort 4, a 39% reduction. And cohort 5, a 54% reduction. In other words, as we're giving more of this potent anti-inflammatory right into those tissues, we are getting a better dose response. And remember, we are still only covering 60% of the esophagus. We have not even achieved full coverage yet. And yet we are seeing, when you compare this and look at other products that are out there, which I would encourage you to do, you will see that 0.33 is a reduction. That 54% reduction is very, very meaningful and really is going beyond what is really seen today. We also look at the grade. And again, same thing here. You're seeing a 7% reduction in cohort 3, 37% reduction in cohort 4, and a 54% reduction in cohort 5. The last piece of the data here is the peak eosinophil count. So again, these are those sort of cells that drive this allergic reaction at the very beginning, and you want to see those tamped down. And here in cohort 3, it's a 55% reduction. In cohort 4, it's a 67% reduction. And in cohort 5, an 83% reduction in peak eosinophil count. So when we look at this data, you'll recall that there were 3 things that are really important that we see. Number 1 is clinical remission. Patients feel better. We demonstrated that. Number 2 is that we see the fibrosis get better, that inflammation get better. That's that EoE-HSS, and we've demonstrated that. Now, these are small numbers, but we are seeing the dose response, and we're not even really sort of barely halfway through our treatment escalation. And peak eosinophil count we want to see reduced, and we're seeing that in a very meaningful way. So why? Why the duration? Why the efficacy? It comes back to the technology. It comes back to that diffuse sphere that is being placed directly into the tissues. On the right-hand side is the pharmacokinetics. In other words, we are actually measuring the drug levels. And those drug levels directly correlate to the response that we are seeing in patients. So it is very predictable. The more drug we give, the better response we are getting. And you can see as we go through the cohorts, we are getting 2 things. A good response as we go up in dose, we see the drug levels go up, and we see the clinical response get better. We are also seeing at 6 months that these drug levels are steady, long-lasting, and we believe on their way for this being a 1-year product, which fits very much for the patient's well-being. Imagine you go from a once-a-week injection to a once-a-year injection at the same time as getting the safety, which is demonstrated on the left side of the screen. This is a steroid, so you have to look at blood glucose and your body's own natural steroid cortisol, and we have no impact here. So in other words, we are demonstrating safety. We have not had any drug-related adverse events. There are just some procedural pieces, which is whenever you have a scope, which is a fairly big sort of tube, it's about like a garden hose that's put down your esophagus. Most people, 20 to 30%, feel some discomfort for a couple of days afterwards. We are seeing exactly that same thing. But remember, these patients are going for that procedure anyway. We are simply piggybacking on it to deliver the treatment. We are really lucky with this. We have had the opportunity to present this data at 3 key conferences in Europe and North America for gastroenterologists. We have won 2 presidential awards because of this data and 1 award of note. Those awards are because of the quality of the data and the kind of data that we are actually seeing coming through. And remember, we are still in our progression phase here. I've talked here about this clinical advisory board, and these are the key members of that clinical advisory board with Dr. Evan Dellin, who's really the most published in this space, who on this topic has at least 5 New England Journal of Medicine publications on EOE. He is the chair of this clinical advisory board, and we are deeply grateful to them for helping to guide us with this program to be able to, what we hope, provide a first-line therapy for patients with EOE long-term every year to control their disease, to avoid the side effects of the disease itself, as well as of many of the other medications that are available today. I'm not going to go through this. I think I've covered really most of this today, which is when we look at this, we believe that by being this once a year piggybacking on a procedure you're already getting, that we really look to be providing something that is safe, something that is effective, something that is cost effective, and avoiding unwanted side effects. And as a result of that, we believe that EP104 GI is going to be part of the future first-line treatment for eosinophilic esophagitis. And it's our belief, along with that of the clinical advisory board, that that is the direction we are headed. So let's talk a little bit before we get into question and answer here about what's ahead. So we just released cohort 5 data. Cohort 6 is fully dosed. That data is coming in early Q1 of 2025. We are going to see more data in Q2, Q3, Q4. So at least once a quarter, we have data reading out from the expansion of this trial. We're going to be meeting with the FDA to discuss what that plan is going forward, where the expectation based on the data, the feedback from the clinical advisory board and regulatory advisors is that once we have finished this phase 2B, which again, that will complete in early 2026, that we will then move into a single phase 3 trial. And ideally, that single phase 3 trial, depending on the data, will be between 150 and 300 patients, fairly quick to recruit, fairly quick to execute. And after that, we would be submitting an NDA to the FDA, provided they agree with these plans, in order to be able to have this on the market, to be able to treat this ever-expanding group of patients who are desperate to be able to feel better. We were very lucky to be able to go to the AppFed conference, which is a conference for patients with eosinophilic disorders. And we discussed with them there how they felt about a treatment that would actually be delivered during their annual endoscopy. 100% of the patients interviewed said they would much prefer that to a daily oral regimen or a weekly injection regimen. They said even if it was twice a year, that would be their preference. So we believe that we look forward to meeting the needs of the patients, the providers, so the physicians, as well as of the payers by providing a very cost-effective, long-lasting alternative. So with that, John, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I really look forward to taking some questions. And to all of you who've been on here, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that you've presented some pretty impressive data to date. One of the questions related to the FDA process says, what guidance has the FDA, if any, provided to you as to data hurdles potentially versus Dupixent and eosinophilia, I believe, that need to be met in order to file an NDA? Have you gotten
Yeah.
any?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And the FDA, this disease is evolving. So initially, when it was an orphan disease, the idea was get rid of the eosinophils, and you're on your way to a product. And now what they're very clearly telling other companies who have failed in their development program, even though they made eosinophils go away. And what they are saying is those three things I talked about. You need to make patients feel better. You need to have that fibrosis and inflammation go away, and you need to reduce the eosinophil count. And so you need to have that whole picture. Now, Dupixent has that whole picture, but not to the extent that I think patients are looking for, although it has been a huge benefit for patients where there just wasn't an alternative before. So we're looking to surpass that and provide something that is safe, long-term, effective. And that's exactly what the FDA is looking for. When you look at Eohilia, which is an oral budesonide slurry, so they're only approved for 12 weeks of treatment. So their data demonstrated efficacy, not to the degree that Dupixent gets efficacy, but only for 12 weeks. So remember, this is a lifelong disease that requires lifelong treatment. So I think that most people, when they look at that, say 3 months of treatment in a lifelong part of disease is not necessarily the solution that they are looking for. And so that is why I believe when Takeda went with its first application, it was turned down by the FDA. So the FDA is making it pretty clear that what they want is something safe, effective, long-term treatment of all three of those pieces. And so we're going to be working very closely with the FDA, as well as the Clinical Advisory Board, who also advised the FDA on what to be looking for. And we believe that the metrics that I just highlighted to you today are exactly what the FDA is telling us that they're going to require. And so we look forward to meeting and exceeding their and our expectations.
Thank you, James. Sorry, I was just addressing another question that came in. A follow-up to that, and maybe you just address, I just want to make sure, says, what is the anticipated durability hurdle for NDA submission? And will the phase 3 require long follow-up biopsies before submitting?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So in terms of the durability, if you think today, the drugs that are available on the market today, which are twofold, are either taken daily or they're taken weekly as an injection. And so we're talking about something, let's say this was once every 6 months. So it did not meet our expectations, but clearly in the data I showed you today, we are already durable for 6 months from a single injection. That's only because we don't yet have the follow-on data, but you can see we're tracking the flat line. So it's likely much longer than 6 months. 6 months would be perfectly acceptable. A twice-a-year product would be well received by patients, well received by physicians and payers. And we know because we've done that research. It would not be a hurdle to the FDA. By getting to 9 and to 12 months, we just make that much better. We plan on really sort of submitting that 6-month data as the first hurdle, and then following on with that 9 and 12-month data. So there is a follow-up period, and that follow-up period is going to be 1 year of follow-up, where we're going to be following patients in the phase 3 program.
Got it. Here's a quick follow-up. Says anticipated cost of EPRX solution versus Dupixent. You spoke a little bit about that, the advantages you think you'll have, but can you speak to that?
So look, I mean, it's always a little bit of a mug's game at this stage to try and predict what the cost will be. So the cost for Dupixent is roughly $100,000 a year for that once weekly injection. We anticipate cost here to be more in the $30,000 to $40,000 a year for that single injection. So again, meeting the needs of the payer, the physician, and the patient by providing what we hope will be, really best in class in terms of efficacy and safety, duration, as well as cost.
It sounds like it's going to fit right in with current belief system that is in power here in the U.S. So hopefully that you're going to come to the market with it, or come to the world with it. Even more importantly, let me ask you a quick question. Do you see? I don't believe any of your programs are partnered at this stage. Is that correct? And in this one specifically, And can you speak to that? How do you see, where do you see Eupraxia going here?
Yeah. So when we look outside the US, we're very interested in partnering. And there are a lot of ongoing discussions that obviously I can't get into detail about, that as our data progresses, it's clear that, as you comment, this isn't just a US market solution, but a world market solution. I showed data about the incidence and prevalence in Europe, and it's very, very high. So we believe that partnering this asset and our osteoarthritis asset are things that are going to be, near to midterm events, be very positive for shareholders, offset cost requirements, for example, for the phase 3 trial that will be coming up in 2026 in this program. So prior to that, we would expect to be looking for the right partnering transactions to really provide best value to shareholders.
Got it. Thank you. Another question had just come in. One of our friends, one of the tribe members says, I had esophageal cancer and I'm going to butcher this up, but the esophagectomy, is that correct? Okay.
Esophagectomy, yeah.
Thank you. My intake is limited and I do have some difficulty swallowing still. Is EOE still a potential issue for him?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And first, thank you for sharing that, whoever shared that. And I'm sorry, I know esophageal cancer and esophagectomy is a very challenging thing to go through. What's been really interesting is, number one, EOE may be an issue and is worth ruling out. But number two, one of the things we know after esophagectomy, after other esophageal problems, that people can actually develop strictures, so where they actually get tight. What's been fascinating is, and this wasn't us who came up with this, unfortunately, but in fact, the Clinical Advisory Board, who, remember, these are the esophageal world experts. And they came to us and said, yes, this is a great medicine for EOE. However, there are millions of patients like what we're hearing here with an esophagectomy, who are having strictures, a tightening and inflammation in their esophagus. And they have said, we would like to use this drug in those patients to make their life better, because right now there are no drugs for that. All they can do is either sort of live with the symptoms or occasionally have a balloon go in and expand things, which works just temporarily. And so we believe that there's a very fast follow-on in parallel with EOE, actually in the strictures market, which is as large as the EOE market. So creates two parallel opportunities and really a very sort of rapid approval path and uptake by physicians, because it's the same physician, same drug, same mode of administration. So hopefully we will be available to help this person who's asking that question.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to introduce you. I believe I'm not sure if we met him recently, but when we had out on the road, but I'll definitely help make that happen.
Please do.
Just switching gears on the financial picture, because we have to deal with that as well in this world. Again, remember the ticker symbol here is on the Nasdaq is EPRX, as well as on the TSX. You recently announced a very significant funding that I believe was dominated by one of the investors that's actually on your board now. Can you speak to that financing? Again, this was above market, impressive, significant amount of $40+ million, and where that takes you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did just complete a $44.5 million non-brokered private placement. And that was led by Joseph Friedman, who is joining our board. And we are absolutely thrilled to have him. He'd already been a previous investor. And as you'll notice, if you see his bio on our website, incredibly impressive. I can't do justice to all of it, but he was really running private equity at Brookfield. And so really understands the search for value, the search for growth, and really saw, I think, number one, in our assets, and number two, in the DiffuSphere platform, the ability for us to grow well beyond where we are today. over not just the near and midterm, but also in the long term. And so you're absolutely right. This financing was done at a 40% premium to the share price at the time. There are no warrants attached to this. This was a very nice 40% premium financing and really reflects their long-term growth perspective, their patience as investors. And that money takes us through to the latter part of 2026. So if you'll recall, when I was talking about the data, that means it's going to get us through the phase 2 program in EOE, through our end of phase 2 meeting, and really to the very beginning of our phase 3 program in EOE, which means we're also going to have the time to be doing partnering transactions, such as the ones that we've talked about, which may obviate the need for significant capital requirements in the future, depending on what deals we choose to do and how we choose to do them.
Fantastic. Congratulations on that. That gives you quite a runway to go create value as you continue to do. One last question, and I know we kind of talked a little bit about it, but it just popped up, is regards to the RFK situation that's buzzing around the world. Hesitate to bring this up with the political charged sort of commentary, but do you think you're well positioned with Eupraxia with regard to what's anticipated here?
So look, I'll caveat this by saying that you know, first, I don't know where RFK stands on everything. Certainly, you know, his desire to look into things to make them more efficient, to be able to ensure that drugs that are getting to patients are safe, and that they work well. If you think about what we do as a company, we take existing drugs. What we've talked about today, the data we're generating, we have taken fluticasone propionate, which is used quite literally by millions of people across the world every day, very safely. And what we have done is used a very effective technology in our diffusphere to take advantage of all the good parts of that drug and avoid the bad parts. Oh, excuse me, I thought I was going to sneeze. Excuse me, I've never sneezed on a webinar before. Apologies for that.
Bless you.
They're cutting grass outside. And so I do believe that when you look at the sorts of statements that he makes, that we very much align with how do you get good, safe products to market faster. That's exactly the way we are designed. We're using existing drugs. We're altering the way that they are delivered. We're being more precise. We're optimizing efficacy and reducing side effects and off-target effects. And I think that really fits in line with what we have heard publicly that he's saying. So we think in this environment, a company like ours may actually have an opportunity to thrive even more than it might have already.
Got it. Thank you for commenting on that. And then one last question here is you referenced the OA program. Is there a goal to provide any updates regards to the program at all, or partnering by anytime soon with the data you've had out to date?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're thrilled with the data we've had there. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it was published about a month ago in the Lancet, really, highlighting having the top and most referenced journal in the world publish our osteoarthritis data, really shone the spotlight on it, both amongst physicians as well as amongst companies we were already in discussions with. And we believe that there are some very real opportunities. And I think I would watch this space closely in the earlier part of 2025 for developments in the OA program as we push forward towards market launch with that program. Again, coming back to the partnering point, we are not the commercial entity, and so a partnership with somebody who has a commercial sales force and will be commercially launching that would be the expectation.
Okay, yeah, with the significant market opportunity, I could see how at least you'd be piquing interest with this latest data. I also understand you're looking to get across the U.S. here and let a few more folks know about Eupraxia. And we stand committed to getting you in front of in a number of the tribe sites. Again, we're across 35 tribe sites. If many of you want to see and meet James, please express to the wish list process. Let us know, and we'll do our best to try to coordinate. And what I would also suggest is that recently he's been picking up some coverage from the investment banking community analyst, and that they have that research is available too. So let us know if you need that, or we can point you in the right direction to get that. And they have some very positive buy recommendations on it. I know recently one of them came out with a $9 target price, and we're at $3 today. So that's an interesting initial look at you, and they just launched coverage. So anyway, there's information coming out. There's the ability to get in front of James as he moves forward across the U.S. with us. Just let us know, and I appreciate everyone coming today. James, would you like to end with any final statement here before we sign off?
Yeah, absolutely. At first, just to thank you again, John, to you, to the tribe, to everybody who took the time here today. I hope that you learned a little bit about eosinophilic esophagitis. I wish I'd learned more about this in medical school and training, but it really is a disease that is coming up. We wish that it wasn't growing that rapidly for the patients who suffer from it, but we're very glad to be part of the solution. And again, we look forward to being part of the solution in EOE, in osteoarthritis. And as we look forward with our platform, you can imagine this kind of precision, this kind of capability to be hyper-localized in oncology and helping patients with cancer. So we really appreciate people taking the time to learn the story, supporting us, and for us to be able to provide great solutions for patients. So thank you all, and feel free to reach out to us directly through John, and always available. And thank you again.
Yeah, and thank you too, James, for sharing your morning with us and getting us a little more informed about Eupraxia. Again, remember the company trades on the Nasdaq EPRX and on the TSX as well, the same symbol. We'll have this event video if you want to review any of this information up at the Tribe Public YouTube channel as soon as we can today. And again, let us hear from you. Embrace the wish list process. If you want to see Eupraxia, Dr. James, come on out to your part of the country here, just let us know. And if you want to get an update from him via webinar, let us know that too, if you're around the world where we're not hosting live events as he progresses. Again, thank you all. Have a great weekend. And thank you again, Eupraxia and James.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everybody.